My sister called me a coward who hides behind a uniform, but when my commander opened her gift and went completely silent, I knew everything was about to change. The morning sun was cutting through the blinds of Colonel Martinez's office, casting long shadows across his mahogany desk where that package sat like a ticking bomb. I could hear the distant sound of morning PT echoing across the base, soldiers calling cadence in perfect rhythm, but all I could focus on was the manila envelope with my sister's familiar handwriting scrawled across the front. Before I share what happened in that office, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are in the world. I love hearing how far this story reaches, especially to those who understand what it means to serve in silence. My family never understood why I chose the military. To them, I was the failure who ran away from real responsibility, the one who could not handle civilian life, so I played dress-up in fatigues. My sister Rebecca was the worst of all. She had her corner office in Manhattan, her designer suits, her weekend trips to the Hamptons, and she never let me forget that while she was climbing corporate ladders, I was crawling through mud in places she could not even pronounce. Every family gathering was the same routine. She would arrive in her luxury car, designer purse slung over her shoulder, and immediately start in on me. "You still playing soldier?" she would say with that condescending smile that made my jaw clench. "When are you going to get a real job and contribute something meaningful to society?" Mom would try to change the subject, but Rebecca never let it go. She would talk about her latest promotion, her salary increases, her investment portfolio, all while looking at me like I was some charity case who needed career counseling. Dad would nod along, clearly proud of his successful daughter and clearly disappointed in his son who chose service over success. The irony was suffocating. While Rebecca was in her air-conditioned office negotiating contracts for her marketing firm, I was doing things I could never tell them about. Things that kept them safe in their suburban bubble where the biggest crisis was whether the country club would approve their membership renewal. They had no idea that their soldier son had spent the last 8 years in places that did not exist on any public map, working with people whose names appeared in classified briefings that only a handful of people in the world were cleared to see. Christmas dinner last year was particularly brutal. Rebecca had just gotten engaged to some hedge fund manager named Brad, and she spent the entire evening planning their destination wedding in Tuscany. $200,000 for a weekend party, she bragged, while I sat there thinking about the village in Afghanistan where that money could build a school for 300 children. She kept making jokes about how I would probably show up to her wedding in combat boots, how I had never learned to dress like a civilian, how embarrassing it was to have a brother who still lived in government housing at my age. What she did not know was that I had been living in base housing by choice, not necessity. The Army had offered me positions that would have doubled my salary, desk jobs in the Pentagon where I could wear suits and play politics with the best of them. But I chose to stay where the real work was happening, where my skills were needed most, where lives depended on decisions I made in split seconds that she would spend months debating in boardroom meetings. My mother tried to defend me sometimes, in her gentle way. She would mention my commendations, my rapid promotions, the fact that I had been selected for assignments that most soldiers only dreamed about. But Rebecca would wave her hand dismissively and change the subject back to her latest client acquisition or her upcoming vacation to Dubai. Nothing I accomplished in uniform could compete with her quarterly bonuses or her stock options. The worst part was watching my parents slowly start to believe her narrative. They began asking when I was going to settle down, get out of the service, start a real career. They worried about my future, as if 8 years of exemplary service meant nothing. As if the letters of recommendation in my file from generals and senators were just participation trophies. As if the medals locked away in my footlocker were trinkets from a game rather than recognition for actions that saved lives. Rebecca loved to point out that I was 30 years old and still single, still living like a college student, still taking orders from other people instead of giving them. She could not understand that some of us find purpose in something bigger than profit margins. She could not comprehend that leadership in the military meant something different than management in corporate America. To her, my willingness to follow orders was weakness, not discipline. My commitment to service was immaturity, not honor. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by regular mail to the base. My name was typed on a standard mailing label, but I recognized Rebecca's handwriting on the return address immediately. She had never sent me anything before, not even a birthday card, so I knew this was not going to be pleasant. The envelope was thick, heavy, like it contained documents or photographs. I held it in my hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of whatever cruelty she had decided to mail across the country. I should have opened it immediately, should have dealt with whatever poison she had decided to send. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the timing, arriving just days before my next deployment was supposed to be announced. Maybe it was the way the morning light was hitting the envelope, making it look ominous and final. Maybe it was just intuition telling me that whatever was inside was going to change something fundamental. Instead of opening it, I walked straight to Colonel Martinez's office. He was my commanding officer, but more than that, he was a mentor who had guided my career through some of the most challenging assignments the Army had to offer. He had been the one to recommend me for specialized training, the one who had seen potential in me when others saw just another enlisted soldier looking for direction. If anyone could help me process whatever Rebecca had sent, it would be him. I knocked on his door frame, waiting for permission to enter. He looked up from the stack of reports on his desk, his weathered face breaking into the slight smile he reserved for soldiers he genuinely respected. "Come in," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What brings you by this morning?" I could hear the genuine warmth in his voice, the tone he used when he was speaking to someone he considered more than just another subordinate. I sat down and placed the envelope on his desk, sliding it across the polished wood surface. "This came for me today," I said, my voice steadier than I felt inside. "It is from my sister. She has never sent me anything before, and, given our relationship, I am concerned about what might be inside. I was hoping you could open it, in case it contains something that might affect my clearance or my deployment status." The words sounded professional, but Colonel Martinez had known me long enough to hear the uncertainty underneath. He picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands, examining the postmark and return address with the careful attention he brought to everything. "Your sister," he repeated, and I could tell he was remembering the conversations we had shared about family dynamics, about the challenge of maintaining relationships with people who could not understand the life we had chosen. He had his own stories about family members who saw military service as a last resort rather than a calling. The morning sun had shifted, casting new shadows across his office as he carefully opened the envelope. I watched his face as he pulled out the contents, seeing his expression change from casual curiosity to something harder to read. His eyes moved across whatever Rebecca had sent, and I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant sounds of the base coming to life around us. Colonel Martinez set the papers down on his desk, face down so I could not see what they contained. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing not just what he had read, but what it meant about my family, about the relationships I had been navigating while trying to serve my country. The weight of that silence was heavier than any briefing I had ever received, more intense than any mission preparation I had ever endured. He reached for his phone, pressing a button that connected him directly to his secretary. "Hold my calls for the next hour," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off me. Then he stood up, walked around his desk, and closed the office door, something he only did when we needed to discuss classified information or personal matters that required absolute privacy. When he turned back to face me, I could see something in his expression that I had never seen before. It was not anger exactly, but it was close. It was the look he got when he was dealing with an injustice that needed to be corrected, a wrong that needed to be made right. He sat back down, picked up the papers again, and began to read them more carefully, taking his time with each page. I sat there waiting, watching his face, trying to read the emotions that flickered across his features as he absorbed whatever Rebecca had decided to share about her brother the soldier. The clock on his wall ticked steadily, marking time that felt suspended, frozen in this moment between my old life and whatever was about to begin. Outside his window, I could see soldiers going about their morning routines, unaware that in this small office, something significant was shifting. Colonel Martinez finally looked up at me, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made every word feel deliberate and important. "Son," he said, "we need to talk about your family, and about some things they clearly do not understand about who you are and what you have accomplished. But first, I need to make some phone calls. This conversation is going to require some people who outrank both of us." He was reaching for his secure phone, the one reserved for communications that went well beyond the normal chain of command, and I realized that whatever Rebecca had sent was about to expose truths that had been carefully guarded for years. The morning that had started like any other was about to become something entirely different, something that would force my family to confront their assumptions about their soldier son who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The secure phone rang twice before a voice I recognized answered. "General Hayes," Colonel Martinez said, his tone carrying the formality reserved for conversations that would be recorded and reviewed. "I have a situation that requires your immediate attention. It involves Sergeant Morrison and some classified information that has been compromised by a civilian family member." I could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, the sound of someone who understood exactly what that meant in our world. While Colonel Martinez spoke in careful code words, I found myself remembering the first time I had been read into the program that would define my military career. I was 24 years old, barely 2 years into my service, when I was pulled aside after a routine training exercise. A man in civilian clothes had approached me, introduced himself only as Mr. Chin, and asked if I was interested in serving my country in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. I thought he was recruiting me for intelligence work, maybe translation services since I had tested high in language aptitude. What I discovered was something far more complex and dangerous. The Army had identified soldiers with specific skill sets, psychological profiles that indicated we could handle isolation, stress, and moral ambiguity without breaking. We were trained in advanced combat techniques, counter-terrorism operations, and diplomatic protection that went far beyond anything taught in regular military schools. Our missions took us to places that officially did not exist, working alongside people whose real names we never learned, protecting assets and gathering intelligence that kept conflicts from becoming wars. My first assignment was in a country I cannot name, protecting a diplomat whose negotiation efforts were preventing a regional conflict that could have destabilized half a continent. For 6 months, I lived in the shadows of a foreign capital, speaking only the local language, carrying identification that would dissolve in water if discovered. My family thought I was stationed in Germany, learning logistics management. They had no idea I was preventing an assassination that would have started a war involving 3 nations and cost thousands of lives. Rebecca had sent Christmas cards to my supposed address in Ramstein Air Base, while I was actually living in a safe house in Eastern Europe, watching for threats that could emerge from any direction at any moment. She complained that I never called home enough, not knowing that operational security meant weeks of complete communication blackout. She worried that I was not advancing in my career fast enough, unaware that I had already been promoted twice through classified channels that did not appear on any public record. The irony was suffocating. While she was negotiating marketing budgets for luxury brands, I was negotiating the release of hostages taken by groups that most people only read about in heavily censored news reports. While she was worried about quarterly earnings, I was worried about intelligence that suggested terrorist cells were planning attacks on American soil. While she was building her professional network at cocktail parties, I was building relationships with assets who risked their lives to pass information that prevented catastrophes. Colonel Martinez hung up the secure phone and immediately dialed another number, this one going directly to the Pentagon. The conversation was brief but intense, filled with references to classification levels and authorization codes that I recognized but had never expected to hear spoken aloud in connection with my own situation. He was explaining that operational security had been compromised by a family member who had no understanding of what they were dealing with. As I sat there listening to him make calls that would reach the highest levels of military leadership, I thought about all the times my family had made me feel small, insignificant, like a burden they had to tolerate at family gatherings. They had no idea that the son they dismissed as a failure had been personally commended by foreign heads of state for actions that prevented international incidents. They did not know that the medals locked in my footlocker included recognition from allied nations for joint operations that had dismantled trafficking networks and stopped weapons shipments to terrorist organizations. The worst memory was last Thanksgiving, when Rebecca had brought her fiancé Brad to meet the family. He was exactly what she wanted, polished and successful, with an MBA from Wharton and a portfolio worth more than most people made in a lifetime. Throughout dinner, they had talked about their vacation plans, their investment strategies, their plans to buy a house in the Hamptons. When the conversation turned to me, Rebecca had actually apologized to Brad for her brother the soldier, explaining that some people just were not cut out for the real world. What she did not know was that 3 weeks before that dinner, I had been in a classified briefing room receiving thanks from the Secretary of Defense for preventing a cyber attack that would have shut down the electrical grid for the entire eastern seaboard. The operation had required me to work with a team of specialists from 5 different agencies, coordinating a response that neutralized the threat without the public ever knowing how close they had come to disaster. While Rebecca was worried about her stock portfolio, I was protecting the infrastructure that made her comfortable life possible. Brad had asked me what I did in the Army, and before I could answer, Rebecca had jumped in with her standard explanation. "He pushes papers and follows orders," she had said with a laugh that made my stomach turn. "Nothing too complicated, just basic military stuff. You know how it is with people who could not handle college." I had smiled politely and changed the subject because explaining that I held 3 advanced degrees earned through military education programs would have required revealing information that could compromise ongoing operations. Colonel Martinez finished his calls and turned his full attention back to me, but first he picked up the papers Rebecca had sent and read through them again more slowly. His expression grew darker with each page, and I could see him struggling to control his reaction to whatever cruelty my sister had decided to share. The morning light had shifted again, and the shadows in his office seemed longer, more ominous, as if the very atmosphere was responding to the weight of what was being revealed. He set the papers down and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something that mixed anger with protective instincts and professional concern. "Your sister," he began, then stopped himself and started over. "The person who sent this has no understanding of who you are or what you have sacrificed for this country. She has taken your desire to maintain operational security and twisted it into something ugly, something that diminishes your service and your character." The papers contained photographs Rebecca had taken at family gatherings, images of me in civilian clothes looking uncomfortable and out of place, accompanied by her written commentary about my failures and shortcomings. She had created what amounted to a dossier of family disappointment, complete with her analysis of my psychological problems and her theories about why I had never been able to succeed in the real world. She had sent it to my commanding officer as if it were evidence of instability, as if she were trying to get me removed from service for my own good. What Rebecca did not understand was that Colonel Martinez had access to my real military record, not the sanitized version that appeared in public databases. He knew about the commendations from foreign governments, the classified awards that recognized actions taken in service of national security, the psychological evaluations that consistently rated me as exceptionally stable under extreme stress. He knew that my apparent discomfort at family gatherings had nothing to do with social anxiety and everything to do with the cognitive dissonance of being treated as a failure by people who had no idea what real success looked like. The most painful part of Rebecca's package was a letter she had written to Colonel Martinez, explaining her concerns about her brother's mental health and requesting that he be given a medical discharge for his own protection. She described me as someone who had never been able to handle responsibility, who had joined the military as an escape from adult expectations, who was clearly struggling with the demands of service life. She offered to help coordinate my transition back to civilian life, where she could help me find appropriate work that matched my limited capabilities. Reading her words through Colonel Martinez's eyes, seeing how her genuine concern was based on complete ignorance of who I had become, was more devastating than any enemy fire I had ever faced. She truly believed she was helping me, rescuing me from a life that was too challenging for my abilities. She had no way of knowing that the challenges I faced on a daily basis made civilian life seem simple by comparison, that the responsibilities I carried made her corporate achievements look like elementary school projects. Colonel Martinez stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the base where soldiers were conducting their morning training. For a long moment, he did not speak, and I could see him working through the implications of what Rebecca had sent. This was not just about hurt feelings or family dysfunction. This was about a security breach, a civilian who had attempted to interfere with military operations based on assumptions that could have compromised classified programs. When he turned back to me, his voice carried the authority of someone who had made a decision that would change everything. "Son," he said, "we have kept your real service record classified for 8 years because that is what operational security required. But your family's ignorance has created a situation that threatens not just your well-being, but potentially ongoing operations. We need to correct this misunderstanding in a way that protects national security while ensuring that you never have to endure this kind of treatment again." He walked back to his desk and picked up the secure phone again, but this time the call was different. This time he was not asking for permission or reporting a problem. This time he was issuing orders, coordinating a response that would involve multiple agencies and levels of government. I listened as he arranged for a security review, a declassification evaluation, and what he called a family notification protocol that would be handled by specialists trained in managing civilian exposure to classified information. The morning that had started with Rebecca's cruel package was transforming into something far more significant. Decisions were being made at levels of government that most people never imagined, all because my sister's attempt to destroy my military career had instead exposed the gap between who my family thought I was and who I actually had become. The soldier they dismissed as a failure was about to be revealed as someone whose service had protected their comfortable lives in ways they could never have imagined. Colonel Martinez set down the phone and looked at me with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal affection. "The next few days are going to be interesting," he said with the slight smile he reserved for understatements of massive proportions. "Your family is about to learn some things about their soldier son that are going to change their perspective permanently. And your sister's attempt to sabotage your career is about to backfire in ways she never could have anticipated." As I sat there processing what he had said, I realized that 8 years of carefully maintained operational security were about to end. The family that had dismissed me as a failure was about to discover that their assumptions had been not just wrong, but dangerously naive. Rebecca's package, intended to expose my weaknesses, was instead about to expose truths that had been classified at the highest levels of government, truths that would force everyone who thought they knew me to reconsider everything they believed about service, sacrifice, and what it really meant to protect the people you loved. 3 days later, I found myself standing in the visiting center at Fort Bragg, watching my family walk through security with the confused expressions of people who had no idea why they had been summoned to a military installation by official government correspondents. Rebecca looked particularly uncomfortable in her designer suit, clutching her purse like it might protect her from whatever unpleasantness she was about to endure. My parents flanked her on either side, my father trying to project confidence he clearly did not feel, my mother wringing her hands with the nervous energy of someone who suspected this meeting was connected to the package her daughter had sent. The letter they had received was official, bearing the seal of the Department of Defense and signed by someone whose title required multiple lines to accommodate all the acronyms and classifications. It had been politely worded but absolutely clear in its expectations. Their presence was requested for a matter of national security involving their son and brother, Sergeant Morrison. Transportation would be provided. Attendance was not optional. Questions would be answered upon arrival. I had spent those 3 days in briefings that felt surreal, sitting in rooms with generals and intelligence officials who treated me with a level of respect that my family could never have imagined. They explained the delicate process of selective declassification, the careful balance between protecting ongoing operations and correcting a security breach that threatened to destabilize a valuable asset. That asset was me, though they used more clinical language to describe someone whose family relationships had become a liability to national security. The decision had been made at levels that required congressional notification. 8 years of classified service would be partially revealed, enough to correct my family's dangerous misunderstanding while maintaining protection for operations that remained active. It was unprecedented, they told me, but my sister's attempt to interfere with my military service had created a situation that demanded extraordinary measures. The irony was perfect. Rebecca's effort to destroy my career had instead prompted the highest levels of government to protect it. Colonel Martinez entered the visiting center wearing his dress uniform, ribbons and decorations, creating a colorful display across his chest that immediately commanded attention. Behind him walked two men in civilian suits, who moved with the careful precision of people accustomed to handling sensitive situations. One introduced himself as Mr. Patterson from the Department of Defense, the other as Dr. Williams from what he vaguely described as an interagency task force. Their presence transformed the casual visiting center into something that felt official and important. My family was escorted to a private conference room, the kind used for sensitive communications that required both privacy and security. I could see the confusion growing on their faces as they realized this was not a casual visit or a family emergency. This was something far more serious, something that involved levels of government they had never considered in connection with their soldier son who pushed papers and followed orders. Rebecca spoke first, her voice carrying the confidence she used in boardroom negotiations, but with an edge of uncertainty that betrayed her growing discomfort. "I sent some information about my brother to his commanding officer," she said, looking directly at Colonel Martinez. "I was concerned about his mental health and his ability to handle military service. I hope this meeting is not some kind of retaliation for a family member expressing legitimate concerns about a soldier's well-being." Colonel Martinez responded with the calm professionalism that had guided him through decades of military service, his voice carrying authority that filled the room without becoming aggressive. "Ms. Morrison," he said, "your concerns have been noted and thoroughly investigated. However, your information was based on fundamental misunderstandings about your brother's service record and his role in military operations. This meeting has been arranged to correct those misunderstandings and to ensure that future communications regarding Sergeant Morrison are properly informed." Mr. Patterson opened a briefcase and removed a folder marked with classification stamps that made my parents lean forward instinctively. The documents he spread across the table were carefully redacted, but contained enough information to begin dismantling 8 years of family assumptions. Awards, commendations, efficiency reports that used language like exceptional performance under extreme conditions and consistently exceeds expectations in high-stress environments. Performance evaluations that recommended advancement and increased responsibility rather than medical discharge. "Your son," Dr. Williams explained in the patient tone of someone accustomed to delivering information that challenged fundamental beliefs, "has been serving in specialized capacity that required maintaining cover for operational security purposes. His apparent lack of career advancement in public records was deliberate misdirection designed to protect both him and the operations he supported." The family gatherings where he seemed uncomfortable and out of place were actually quite stressful for someone trained to maintain false identity while surrounded by people who knew him before his military service began. I watched my mother's face as she processed the carefully chosen words, seeing her begin to understand that the son she had worried about was not struggling with military life, but rather excelling in ways that could not be publicly acknowledged. My father's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like pride mixed with concern, as if he was realizing that his soldier son had been protecting secrets that were far more significant than anyone had imagined. Rebecca's reaction was different. She looked at the documents with the analytical skills she used to evaluate marketing proposals, scanning for details that would support or refute the claims being made about her brother. I could see her struggling to reconcile the official government assessment with her own observations, trying to find flaws in information that came with the authority of the United States military and intelligence community. Colonel Martinez continued the briefing with the methodical approach he used for all serious military presentations. Sergeant Morrison has participated in operations that prevented international incidents, protected diplomatic personnel in hostile environments, and gathered intelligence that contributed to national security objectives. His psychological evaluations consistently rate him as exceptionally stable under pressure, with leadership potential that has been recognized at the highest levels of military command. The concerns expressed in your correspondence are inconsistent with his actual performance record. The room fell silent as my family absorbed information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about their soldier son and brother. I could see them struggling to process the implications, trying to understand how the person they had dismissed as a failure could be described in terms that suggested exceptional competence and valuable service. The cognitive dissonance was visible on their faces as they confronted the gap between their assumptions and documented reality. Dr. Williams added context that made the situation even more complex. Military personnel in specialized roles often experience difficulty maintaining normal family relationships because operational security requirements prevent them from sharing information about their actual duties and accomplishments. What family members interpret as social awkwardness or lack of ambition is frequently the result of trained professionals who cannot discuss their real work without compromising national security. This creates stress for both the service member and their loved ones who feel excluded from important aspects of their life. Rebecca finally found her voice, though it carried none of the confidence she had displayed earlier. "Are you telling me," she asked slowly, "that when I thought he was failing at basic military service, he was actually involved in classified operations that I am not allowed to know about?" Her tone suggested she was still struggling to accept that her analysis of her brother's situation had been completely wrong. Mr. Patterson answered with the diplomatic precision of someone who had delivered similar briefings to civilian family members who had inadvertently compromised operational security. "What we are telling you is that your brother's service record reflects consistent excellence in challenging assignments that required personal sacrifice and professional discretion. Your recent correspondence attempted to characterize this discretion as instability and requested his removal from service. This created a security concern that required evaluation at multiple levels of government." The implications of what he was saying began to dawn on my family. Rebecca's attempt to help her struggling brother had instead triggered a security review that involved the Department of Defense, intelligence agencies, and congressional notification. Her package of family photographs and psychological analysis had been evaluated by professionals who understood the difference between genuine instability and the operational requirements of classified service. My mother spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice small and uncertain. "Have we put him in danger?" she asked, by not understanding what he was doing. "Have our questions and concerns about his career created problems for him that we never intended?" I could hear the guilt in her voice as she realized that their family's worry about my future had actually threatened the security of operations they could not even imagine. Colonel Martinez responded with the gentleness he reserved for family members who were confronting difficult truths about their loved ones in military service. "Mrs. Morrison, your family's concerns came from love and genuine worry about your son's well-being. However, those concerns were based on incomplete information that led to incorrect conclusions. Moving forward, it would be helpful if questions about Sergeant Morrison's military service were directed through appropriate channels rather than through analysis based on civilian observations of his behavior during family visits." The meeting continued for another hour as my family was briefed on the basics of operational security, the importance of discretion in military families, and the procedures for addressing future concerns about my service without compromising classified information. They signed documents acknowledging their understanding of the sensitive nature of what they had learned and agreeing to maintain appropriate confidentiality about the details of my actual military role. As we prepared to leave the conference room, Rebecca approached me for the first time since the meeting began. Her designer confidence had been replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse, mixed with confusion about how dramatically her understanding of our relationship had shifted. "I thought I was helping you," she said quietly, her voice lacking the condescending tone that had characterized our interactions for years. "I thought you were struggling and needed someone to advocate for you with your commanding officers." I looked at my sister, seeing her differently than I had in years. For the first time, I could see past her corporate success and designer lifestyle to recognize someone who genuinely cared about her brother, but had completely misunderstood how to express that care. Her package had been cruel in its execution, but it had come from a place of concern that she simply did not know how to communicate appropriately. "Rebecca," I said, using the gentle tone I had learned from Colonel Martinez for managing difficult conversations, "I understand that you are trying to help. But the next time you are worried about my well-being, maybe we could just talk directly instead of involving my chain of command. There are ways to support family members in the military without creating security incidents that require congressional notification." The drive back to their hotel was quiet, according to what my mother told me later. My family spent the evening processing what they had learned, trying to reconcile their new understanding of my military service with the assumptions that had guided their treatment of me for 8 years. Rebecca called me the next morning, her voice carrying a humility I had never heard before. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "Not just for the package, but for years of treating you like you were failing when you were actually succeeding in ways I could not understand. I thought success looked like my career, my salary, my lifestyle. I never considered that protecting other people might be more important than protecting profit margins." The conversation that followed was the first honest discussion we had shared since I enlisted. Rebecca told me about her own insecurities, her need to feel superior to justify the compromises she had made in pursuit of financial success. I told her about the loneliness of serving in silence, the difficulty of maintaining relationships with people who could not understand the most important aspects of my life. We did not solve everything in one phone call, but we began building a foundation for a different kind of relationship. My parents visited the base again before returning home, this time for a family day event where they could see me in my actual military environment rather than the uncomfortable civilian settings where they had formed their opinions about my service. They met soldiers who worked with me, heard stories about my leadership and competence from people who had served alongside me in challenging situations. My mother cried when a young private told her that I had saved his life during a training accident, using skills that were never mentioned in official reports. The months that followed brought gradual changes to our family dynamic. Rebecca still called to share news about her corporate achievements, but she also asked about my work in ways that showed genuine interest rather than condescending concern. My parents stopped worrying about my future and started expressing pride in my service, even though they still could not know the details of what I actually did for the country they loved. The package that was meant to destroy my military career had instead forced my family to confront their assumptions about success, service, and what it meant to contribute something meaningful to the world. Rebecca's gift of cruelty had become an unexpected gift of understanding, creating space for relationships based on truth rather than misconceptions. I never told them about the operations that kept them safe while they slept, the threats that were neutralized before they could reach American soil, the international incidents that were prevented through careful diplomacy backed by the kind of strength they would never see displayed at family dinners. But I no longer had to endure their pity for my supposed failures or their concern about my inability to succeed in the real world. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving that you were right, but simply being understood by the people who matter most. Rebecca's betrayal had become the catalyst for the kind of family reconciliation that I had never believed possible, built on respect rather than condescension, on truth rather than assumptions. In trying to expose my weaknesses, she had instead revealed strengths that brought us closer together than we had been since childhood. The real gift was not vindication or revenge, but the quiet satisfaction of being seen clearly by people who had spent years looking at me without really understanding what they were seeing. That was worth more than any medal, more valuable than any commendation, more meaningful than any recognition from strangers who understood my service, but had never shared Sunday dinner with the person behind the uniform.